Hey, hello everybody. Today is February 23rd. Mercury has just ingressed into Pisces, and on February 28th, there will be a Double-Cazimi with Mercury and Saturn conjoin the Sun. And this is an interesting one because, while Cazimis happen fairly regularly, um, Mercury, every time Mercury crosses paths with the Sun, there's a Cazimi. This is in forward motion and in retrograde motion, and that happens multiple times in a year. Saturn is always going to have a Cazimi as the Sun passes the point where Saturn is in the zodiac every year, but rarely do these things coincide where they happen right at the same time, which kind of makes this a kind of an interesting anomaly. And one of the things about Cazimi, which is also interesting, is that when it comes to popular astrology, obviously everybody is very familiar with retrogrades. Like Mercury retrograde tends to be one of the most common things that has made it into the kind of pop lexicon around astrology or the popular consciousness. And the Cazimi is and retrogrades are both part of the synodic cycle, right? So basically what happens with a Mercury Cazimi is that Mercury is in a stage of its synodic cycle where it's moving across the sky at a very fast speed, and then it crosses the path of its the sun, and then later on, once Mercury gets into Aries, then it will start to slow down, station retrograde, and then in retrograde motion, it will approach the sun from the other direction, and then make another Cazimi in retrograde motion later on. And then, with the inner planets like Mercury and Venus, they have this certain pattern. The outer planets like Jupiter and Saturn, because they are on the where the Earth, they're the inner planets relative to the Earth, and Jupiter and Saturn are the outer planets relative to the Earth. It has a different kind of motion with the retrogrades and the synodic cycle. But basically, how this is interpreted is kind of like if you can imagine the planets as if they were cell phones or iPads or electronic devices that have batteries, and it's kind of like at this stage where they're said to be dying, it's kind of like having a low battery where the sun acts as a kind of a charger, where leading up to the Cazimi, you've got these things which are kind of less in power, and then the Cazimi is like a kind of a refresh or a boost, giving these planets new energy, revitalizing these planets, and marking the start of a new cycle. And what is interesting, particularly about this one, is it's happening for two planets simultaneously. And if we look at the actual nature of Mercury and Saturn and what's going on in the archetypal dynamic between these planets, one of the things that's interesting is I kind of alluded to already in the fact that the Mercury is traveling at an extremely fast speed when it makes this Cazimi conjunction, forward motion Cazimi to the sun. It's the fastest part of its synodic cycle. It's often associated with a kind of very fluid stream of thoughts and ideas or communications, and things are coming together really quickly. And then on the contrast, though, Saturn is a planet that stands for the stuff that is so slow. It can be like slow, tedious, difficult, frustrating. I mean, Saturn can stand for a lot of other things than that. I don't want to reduce it, but there is this basic polarity that I find, and I think it resonates a lot with some of the modern day issues that we have. Where if you think about like our very online, internet-based culture, we have we have a world where certain things have been made incredibly easy to us, right? To the extent that I think that people may overlook that in the age before the internet, if you wanted a certain kind of information, if you wanted to find something out, if you wanted to have access to something, it may have required a lot more patience. It may have been a lot more difficult. And I have this certain thing that I have been avoiding social media. I have been avoiding things like TikTok and Twitter and stuff like this. And and if you notice, I have taken a kind of approach to doing my YouTube astrology videos where I've tended, okay, for one thing, to make these videos long format, or I try to do like, maybe like half an hour about, sometimes I go into an hour, but I try to make these videos in a certain kind of format that is not like a TikTok format video, or not like something you'd put on, like, there's these certain things that are very short attention span things that I personally think is kind of ruining. I don't want to be like old man shakes fist at cloud kind of thing with this one, but it's like I kind of feel like we've been reduced to having these really short attention spans. We don't have the ability to sit and pay attention to things for long periods of time. And although that thing can be like, it seems like it makes everything easier, it seems like that enables us, that it actually could be maybe disabling, right? It's kind of like if you have I was also, there's kind of funny, there's kind of, some of the spaces that I hang out in, there's this conversation about neurodiversity coming up. And there's this kind of term of being spiky, right? In that there are some things you may be really good at, and then some things you're not very good at, right? Or that you could have ability in some area and disability in other. But I think that there's something about the technology that we use and the really technology saturated environment that it creates a spiky kind of situation where there's some things that are like, it feels a little bit out of balance, right? Where there's some things that are taking lots of energy and lots of attention and and there's other things that just go out the window because it's almost if you're creating like a character in an RPG and you have to put your like skill points, like when you put all your stuff into this really hyper online, hyper communicative, like, it's the kind of thing, if you think about Mercury as a messenger, right? That Mercury related to sending messages and sending things like through the mail, or like, you're waiting for the communication to come in. But with the internet, it's kind of crazy because everything happens so instantly, right? And we have this sort of like, that we have this one thing that's become so quick and fast and instantaneous that it sort of like, I feel like it has this counter effect that it makes something else more slow. It makes something else more short. Like if there's something that enables us to see or to have this connection to people on the other side of the world, to be connected, like Marshall McLuhan said, to the global village, there's something else or to be very future forward, right? That there's something else that takes us back, right? That puts us back into the Stone Age, or that McLuhan was saying, like the global village was a kind of like a new tribalism. Like we were becoming like it was a new age that was like in its infancy. Like we were tribes competing with each other and having the same kind of territorial disputes and struggles, and that which seems like it's advancing is actually taking us into a new kind of primitivism, right? And there's certain themes coming up for me, almost as in like, it's like almost tempting with this kind of dynamic to reach for a kind of strategy of either like being a Luddite or a neo-primitive, or like, like you want to just abandon all technology and be like the Amish or something like that, right? As a solution. But I don't know if that's necessarily the answer either, right? And this is just, my mind is kind of going in different directions. This is just one possible idea anyways. Some other ideas that I've been having around this one include, the basic thing about Saturn having to do with structure and discipline and stuff like that, and how this is I'm thinking about it in terms of things, like I may have used this idea before, but in terms of things like the difference between having a spiritual practice and being somebody who is in society, or cohabiting with, you know, either your family or your roommates or your friends in a normal situation, versus the kind of people that go off to live in temples or monasteries, or people who become monks, right? It's like the Saturn being like taking some kind of restriction upon yourself, putting yourself in line with a kind of mode of discipline. And there's something about like, because there's a difference, because you could be practicing something like zazen or meditation, but you could be living your life in a way that's really kind of like loosey-goosey. And there's something about the way that these Zen monasteries work, where like it's almost kind of like militaristic, right? In the way that everybody wears the same kind of uniform, everybody eats at the same time, everybody has the same kind of chores. They have this kind of rigid structure that everybody adheres to, and it's kind of like if you take just a meditation practice outside of that environment versus having it in an environment where there's these structures and disciplines and stuff like that. I think it could be a very different experience, right? And but the thing to keep in mind with this is that during this particular transit, Saturn is basically weakening, and it's like I said, like a device that's running out of batteries that needs to get plugged in to the wall to charge to get this refresh or this reboost of energy. And so there's this kind of sense of like those kind of structures feeling a bit weak right now, right? But there's another kind of thing that goes with the weakness versus the strength, or there's also this idea that came up with me about rigidity versus flexibility, and the fact that this is happening in Pisces, which is a mutable sign, and the mutable signs often have to do with a kind of a transition from one thing to another, or the liminal zone, the in-between, or being able to be having two qualities and being able to be flexible between them, right? And that I think, like, I remember this whole thing about, this also relates to some I Ching stuff that I was doing recently. I don't know if I want to get into all of that right now, but I'll say that there was a hexagram that I drew that one of the lines was describing a person pulling a wagon, and the idea that what the strength of the wagon lies in the axle, which if you are like going over bumps in the road, the axle can take a bit of shock, and it's flexible enough that like if you're going over a bump, it doesn't break the axle and your whole wagon just collapses and you're stuck or whatever, right? That it's like, if this whole thing about having this like routine and structure and discipline, or a practice or something, that there can be for moments like this, when the planet Saturn is at a point of being weak or at the end of a cycle and having a recharge, it can help to have a certain kind of flexibility, that you have, your structures can kind of bend and flex. And it's kind of like, this relates to an Alan Watts idea that in an Alan Watts book I was reading, where he was saying that the mind, he was talking about this in terms of like madness and sanity, that it's important not to be too hyper-rational, too sane, that your mind is something that can go through these bumps, or that if there is like, it's the idea of like a tree in strong winds, that if a tree has to have some flexibility so that the wind can blow it around and its branches can shake, but it's not so brittle that it's just going to snap and fall apart, right? And that there's a kind of, it's not to say that the structure, not to say the structure itself is just something that makes things brittle and rigid, and that like it's this balance between having structure and having the ability to be flexible, right? Another thing that I thought about, I was thinking about including in this video, is that when it comes to the dynamic of Sun, Mercury, and Saturn, I don't have this exact pattern in my chart, although I do have a Sun-Saturn conjunction. I do have a Sun applying to a combust Saturn, a chart that is leading towards a Sun-Saturn Cazimi. And so this is kind of something that is like, I'm very familiar with because my own chart is influenced by this dynamic, although I don't have Mercury in that sign, so I don't have the same Mercury influence, right? But there is something about this that I relate to in terms of, like, very simply, like, my family, my parents were more progressive, more permissive, and I have to admit there were sometimes certain situations where maybe I wanted to do something, I wanted to go out with some friends, and my family didn't like it, and they thought it was a bad idea, and they put some restriction on me, or, some parental limitation on me. But a lot of the time that parental limitation wasn't really there, right? And this whole, I kind of feel like my adolescence and my growing up, like I wasn't very, I wasn't running up so much against this parental wall where I was like challenging my parents over this is what I wanted to do and they were telling me no or something like this. And there's something about the kind of like feeling kind of like, I don't know, maybe a little bit spoiled, but like kind of having this like really not relating to my parents as these authority figures that I had to fight or something like that, right? And there's also kind of funny. There's this thing that happened when I was in my early 20s where I went away to Australia for a whole year, and then when I kind of maybe partied too much, and then when I came back, that was when I had this sort of mental health crisis, right? And then there was maybe a different relation to the problems about limitation and authority and strictness that came up after that, right? But there's something about what happened with me going to there's this Bible parable about the prodigal son and the prodigal son returns, and part of that story is like the family, this idea that the father gives the son these sort of like dictums or these injunctions, or like, you're going to go off and don't do this and don't do that, and these are the rules you need to abide by. And when the prodigal son returns, he says, all those things you told me to do, I didn't listen to them, I broke all the rules. And then the father says, it's okay, son, you're still my son, and we'll take you back, and we'll congratulate you on, even though you didn't listen to the rule. But for me it's kind of funny because I feel like it's like the combust Saturn is kind of like, nobody gave me any rules, or they didn't say like, okay, you're gonna go off, make sure you don't do this, make sure you don't you follow all these things. It was kind of like, let him do what he wants, right? Like there wasn't that sense of a rigid code or order you had to stick by. And so it was kind of like then there was kind of like the transgressions that I made, there was never really anything telling me not to make those transgressions in the first place, right? Although maybe my parents may say, we were never told you to do those things. We never said that those, or whatever, right? That I'm not exactly, it's not to say that I'm doing what my parents wanted me to do, but it was like there was that sense of restrictive order or restrictive code that you had to stick to and follow. It just wasn't there really. And then in the course of, one of the things that I've been noticing recently is that by doing, like, I have to also admit that when it comes to timing techniques, I had this period of time where I was learning different timing techniques like annual perfections and zodiacal releasing and all this kind of stuff. But at this particular point in time, I may look at that kind of stuff a little bit, but I'm just trying to stick to the basic astrology transits. I'm not trying to get into all these like timing techniques. But there is something to do with like progressed charts, right? And that if one of the, like, basically I was just noticing that in my progressed chart, while, I was born with this Sun-Saturn conjunction, and at the time Saturn was combust, Saturn was weak, that force of sort of discipline and a kind of code to stick by wasn't very strong. But it's kind of like, now that if I look at my progressed chart, that the sun is nowhere near Saturn in my progressed chart anymore. And not only that, but that Saturn is that Saturn, which has now come out from under the rays of the sun, is now in a very strong position in my progressed chart. So I'm going through a very Saturnian period of time, and it's like that kind of like, and one of the things that I kind of relate to with this is that I haven't made any decision to make myself a part of joining a religion in some sort of formal way, but I'm very interested in that stuff in a way that like, well, I don't know, maybe I don't have to explain it, but one thing that's interesting is that like in the last couple of years, I've had more contact with people online who are religious in that way. And it's kind of like, for me, it's kind of strange because it's like a bit of a, like my family, I still feel like my family is very like this kind of loosey-goosey, progressive, very accepting, very permissive, not imposing some sort of strict rule or dictum of how I'm supposed to live my life. They're very, but it's sort of like, I feel like that archetype of needing some kind of rules or structure or daily routine. It's like that is, well, when I was born, that was going through this weak kind of dying phase, and now that I'm in my I'm heading more towards I'm in my late 30s now, and middle age is like around the corner, I guess you could say. There's a sense of that Saturn archetype coming out from like behind the clouds or something like that, right? Like and that there's also that kind of image of like Saturn as being a kind of a wall, and Pisces, the wateriness of Pisces. There's a sense of, I think there could also be this thing. I'm just kind of going free, kind of a free association almost, because for some reason I have a lot of ideas around this. That there's something about Saturn in Pisces which I admittedly feels pretty melancholy. If you think about Saturn having this 30-year cycle, and if you were to rewind the clock to like 30 years ago, we're looking kind of like around the time, like there's this whole thing about like around the time like after Kurt Cobain died, and this sort of like this kind of post grunge kind of 90s thing that was like a bit like I don't know if I get into all that, but where am I going with this? Maybe I'm losing track here. The melancholy, there's a certain melancholiness. I was thinking about the Smashing Pumpkins album, Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness, and they had that, despite all my rage, I'm still just a rat in a cage, the Bullet with Butterfly Wings song. Like, I was just a little kid then, but I remember like being, to be aware of the pop music only because I remember hearing about Kurt Cobain's death, and I was just a little kid. I wasn't up on all the cool bands and everything. It barely even registered, and it was only kind of put it together after the fact, being a young millennial, right? But this there's this kind of like melancholiness that goes with Saturn and Pisces that for some people may feel like a depression. It may feel like a downer, and there's something about, keep in mind as well that we've got Neptune in Pisces, and Neptune kind of often has a sort of like fantastical, kind of mystical quality. And I just had this idea that like a lot of the time people may be looking to somehow escape depression or try to escape because like this is what Saturn stands for, this kind of like leaden heaviness, right? And that people struggle with this, and they're trying to look for some way to get out of it. And there's some sort of thing to do with like I don't want to be like a complete like teetotaler or overly strict about sobriety or something like that, but I do think that there's something about this Saturn Mercury Sun conjunction that at its highest manifestation may have to do with a kind of clear-minded, sober thought, a kind of rational appraisal of a situation that may even be good for things like, scientists or, medicine, or having some kind of insight into having some insight into the structure of things, and having the insight into the nuts and bolts of how things work, and having but there's also this sort of there's something about the heaviness and the emotional quality of Pisces, where people may be trying to look for some kind of way to get out of a depressive state. And there's something about where I think that even negativity, or even kind of emotions that don't feel good, have their place. And it's if we try to get rid of them, or if we try to find a clever way to get a one-up on, be oh, I was all depressed and now I just microdose every day and I don't have to deal with those feelings I don't like. It's kind of there's a kind of a mysticism, or a practice where you're working with those feelings of depression, you're working with those feelings of a kind of heaviness, then you're not working against them. You're not trying to be oh, if I, take the right number of vitamins and take the right, herbal, plant medicines and all this, I can just sort of float over the emotion that I don't want to deal with. Whereas if you actually kind of surrender yourself and not try to fight the difficult emotions, then it's sort of a different kind of a process that I think in our culture, where it's too easy just to go and be get lost in infinite distractions of video games and social media or shopping or whatever, and and trying to look for anything to just get away from what doesn't feel good. Although I have to admit that even I, struggle with this too. When I have, there's a lot of times my rational mind can have a certain way of looking at things and being okay with things, but there's an emotion there that I would just really rather the emotion not be there, right? I'd just rather be okay, I can live my life like this, but I don't want to feel this way, right? I don't want to feel this feeling, and I'm trying, and it's and it's that, those negative feelings that may lead me to being kind of adversarial or antagonistic, or trying, but I'm it's you're trying to I just want to make my day-to-day life, my routine existence in this world, not feel like such a drag, why does day in, day out have to be suffering? Why can't it just be a little bit easier, right? But there's something about the sense of this Saturn has a sort of sense of a heavy burden, right? And it's there's something about rather than trying to get one up on that, or trying to get out of that, there's something about accepting that is there, that's part of the package. And it can be this really slow, this also kind of interesting, is that there's this whole idea of alchemy, right, that has to do with Saturn being the lead and the sun representing the gold, right, and Mercury representing a thrice great Hermes, which is the ability to take different things and communicate between them. There's something about this that feels very alchemically charged to me, right? And the part of this alchemical thing with Saturn, to me, feels like having the patience to be able to put yourself through a process that can be very slow and tedious and not immediately gratifying. And there's something about, I have this kind of issue with pop psychology or pop therapy. I'm considering, doing some more therapy and talking to therapists and counselors, but I'm kind of wary of the paradigm that therapy is built on, that is, or the way that our normal everyday life is becoming kind of colonized by therapeutic ideas. And like even just this idea, like how, like if I'm going to look at a therapist, look for therapists online, like, and I look at a bunch of local therapists' websites and they talk about what kind of things that they specialize in or what they help people in, I'm willing to bet quite a number of these therapists have on their bio, we help people who feel stuck in life. People who feel really stuck, we help them move on from this stuck situation. And the thing about this is like, why do we have this presupposition that stuckness is a problem, that being stuck is always bad and then being unstuck is always good, right? That to be stuck means that you're not progressing, you're not growing, you're not developing. That there's something that's been there for a long time and that thing continues to be there and there's no change or something, right? And that in all circumstances, progressing, changing, being carried down the river is always a better thing than being a rock that is stuck in the river, right? And then there's something about Saturn and Pisces where Saturn can very much feel like not so much the flow of the river, but the rock that is just the river's flowing around the rock, right? And that there's certain situations that like, if you were, like imagine that you had a good situation that persisted for a long period of time. You wouldn't necessarily be complaining about being stuck with that. It would only be if you were frustrated with it, right? But like if the situation actually was helpful to you in some way, then there wouldn't really be a problem with being stuck in something that's actually helpful for you. It's only that if it's the stuckness is somehow detrimental or something like this, right? There is this kind of idea that like stagnation, like a swamp, what becomes stagnant can be kind of like toxic, or you need a refresher or something, right? But there's also this kind of idea that if you're looking at the idea of alchemy, that you could think about like having things, we're gonna have these raw materials, and we're gonna have them kind of stewing together for a prolonged period of time. And we're going to have them stuck in a vessel, right? We're going to have them contained in a container. We're going to have them, isolated from other things. And we're going to, in that process of having them, keeping them contained, keeping them isolated, having a kind of fermentation that goes on for a long period of time. There's this thing about like a fermentation process. It's like if you over ferment it, it'll turn to vinegar, right? But if you under ferment it, it won't eat up the sugar properly, right? There's certain things about having the right timing where you're not over fermenting or you're not under fermenting, but still it does help to have a controlled environment where you have a certain control of what's coming in and what's coming out, and this can be like an alchemical lab. And that some therapist who wants to come in and say, "Oh, you're just stuck. What's like? I don't understand what these beakers and these funny bubbling substances are. You're just stuck with this stuff. We need to get you out there." So that like, why is that always the solution? Like, why? Like, isn't that like? I just don't think that there's other ways to look at things. And there's something about Saturn being very like there's something about Mercury. And Mercury being all about wheeling and dealing and communicating and a free kind of flow of ideas and stuff like that. And Saturn being like this hard limit or this sort of structure that you're just like stuck with. But like, is there some way like is there some way that the stuckness or the stubbornness of Saturn can actually not be a bad thing, or that it can actually be something that facilitates something, like it gives a space for something to develop, right? And this is what I'm kind of leading back to what I was trying to get with the conversation about technology and the why I try to make these videos intentionally longer. And I'm not, there's a lot of videos online where people, in order to retain people who have short attention spans, they try to, fill it with as many colorful graphics and animations and, have, like, I make music, but I'm not putting my music in the background as a little upbeat kind of like, like I'm, like talking over a little music beat and having these like colorful graphics. No, I'm doing to be very just like trying to be minimalistic and trying to have a longer frame of time and to have this as giving a kind of a space in which something has the opportunity to arise that wouldn't arise out of it otherwise, right? And that there's some kind of, and by having these sort of restrictions or limitations of like keeping it very simple, keeping it kind of like austere even, that it's not, yeah, it may seem at first like it's a limitation that's stopping things from happening, that's limiting some sort of contact with the outside. But then it's sort of like that, by creating that kind of a space or that kind of a container or that kind of a vessel, it's like it gives the opportunity for something to evolve out of that maybe wouldn't otherwise, right? And there's one of the things that I keep thinking with this transit too, that there are things that I struggle with that are not in any way new or novel in my life, that I kind of look at the things that I have difficulties with that are like those hard kind of Saturn things that like I get impatient with or I get frustrated with or I wish would change but I'm stuck with. And it's just the same stuff like over the last 10 years. There's things have changed in my life. I went and I lived in a different place for a couple of years. I had different periods of time when I was hanging out with different people. But the basic stuff, it's like the same problems I'm faced with over and over again. And it's like there's some kind of idea that like maybe the problems don't go away or find permanent solutions, but by having a kind of like patience to kind of like submit yourself to that and not look at it in terms of like I'm stuck with this and I need to just find some way to get on the little life, the boat and like get it float down the river. There's some kind of thing about like just being the patient, that the kind of patience that develops with being in this really slow process that doesn't seem like it's going anywhere, right? But having like there's this whole Buddhist thing about how like the enlightenment is like a bird that like flies over the mountain like once a year, and then but the bird like rubs its beak against the mountain tip and like gradually wears it down, over like infinite periods of. There's something about that feels like that like if you're just impatient to get on to the next thing, you don't have a shot with that kind of stuff at all, right? And so there's something about the impatient, like having this drive for either like success or achievement or trying to like I honestly, I'm not trying to make this a really popular astrology channel. And I don't think, it may even be that the majority of what the astrology community is like is people who are doing something that I don't feel like I need to be involved with, right? Like, or that, that maybe a lot of people who identify as being like new agers are going off in this direction. And it's like, there's something about this where it's like, I may not be living in a monastery or a temple, but there's this sort of like, one of the things that keeps coming up with me is there's like, I do find it sometimes feel like I have to work against this desire that I do feel like this desire to be like amongst people or to have a peer group or to have more social life or something. But there's something about, like, over the years, I keep learning to appreciate, almost counterintuitively, the isolation, or my own hermitude, or my own removal from social situations. And this kind of thing that, being a young person, it's like you're in this, it kind of feels like you're in this state where you're just like thrown into this stuff going on in life and going on in the world. And it's kind of like in this confused state where you're just so in it with this thing going on that it's like the fish that's in water and doesn't know the water it's swimming in. That you don't have any perspective of, you and your little friends are doing your thing that teenagers do, but you don't have any perspective on it because you're so in it, and that your whole idea of what is good and bad and what you want and what you don't want is basically conditioned by this situation, right? And there is something that I mean, of course, the past and what happens to us as we grow up has some way of shaping our outlook on life. But there's like, in some way, I didn't have as bad of a teenage experience as some people do, but I don't miss being a teenager. And I actually appreciate, there's a perspective that I am developing as I get older, as my interests change and as I mature, that just wasn't there when I was younger. There may have been a kind of like the oak tree and the acorn, or the seed, the initial. So in some way I'm still basically the same person, but there's some kind of there was some kind of thing in a kind of a embryonic seed stage that I feel is starting to blossom and open up. And I don't know, I don't want to just be judgmental about people I used to hang out with, but I think that maybe those social situations that I was in when I was younger weren't really the situation, didn't provide me the environment that I needed to kind of bloom and blossom, or to meet my path, be on my path in life, my destiny, or whatever it would be, right? And I had to admit that I'm a millennial that moved back in, it's like it's not just to say that I'm a boomerang kid, because now I've done it more than once, right? Like, I've gone off and lived other places, and I came back and to my family, and I went off, and then I came back, and it's sort of like, I don't know. There's certain things about the situation that I can be frustrated with, that are not maybe the ideal of what my desired life would look like, but there's something about it where I'm like, there's something about learning to live with the part of it that's not so gratifying, learning to live with the part of it that doesn't appeal to my desire body of what I think I want for myself. And also this kind of thing of like, there's this kind of, like, I haven't been talking so much about Byung in these videos, and I don't know if there's what my audience makes of some of my literary interests that may not be the most obvious thing to bring up in an astrology video. But there's this, like, I've been reading a lot of Byung, and it basically goes with this whole thing that there's like, he talks about the way consumer capitalist society works is to enable people to go and realize their desires, to realize their dreams, to live this sort of pleasure-oriented life. But there's some kind of thing where it's like we start to get this sort of like awareness that may not actually be what's good for us, or that if you actually are enabled to realize your desires, then where does that lead you exactly, right? Do you really think, there's this kind of, I think there's this kind of disillusionment with, where you're like, I mean, it's not to say that I don't like, like when I was younger, I felt like I was maybe a bit more hedonistic, right? I didn't have my basic motivating force in life was just like, I'm just going to have a fun time. I'm going to enjoy myself. I'm going to, do what feels good. But then there's something like that, like if that's what you are, that's what dominates your life, it starts to wear thin pretty quick, right? And there's some other, and then, like what I'm trying to say with the kind of tediousness of Saturn, or there's a kind of like the dullness that isn't immediately gratifying, and having the patience to put yourself through this long, drawn-out process that may not give you this sort of quick fix of having, a video, like instead of making a dumb video on TikTok that doesn't have really much substance, but it's, it gets a lot of people like it, and you feel good because you're getting attention and stuff, but it doesn't, like, what does that ultimately do for you in the bigger picture of things, right? There's I don't know, that's basically where I'm going with this, is there's this kind of like this idea. There's an artist, Jenny Holzer, who had this idea of like she would do these artistic pieces where they were just phrases or words, and one of them was like, protect me from what I want, right? That there's something about like Saturn as being a limiting force, or a kind of a wall or an obstacle, but like maybe sometimes like we need that, or maybe like this whole story about like the whole pretense to seeing a therapist or a counselor or even an astrologer to be like, talk to me and I will help you. I'll help enable you to realize your dreams, to get what you want. But then it's like, well, maybe those dreams aren't what I want, or no, maybe what I want isn't good for me. Maybe there's a whole culture about dangling these like carrots in front of your face, or these desire things like, oh, wouldn't you want to be a famous DJ and play all these festivals? Wouldn't you want to have a big party? Wouldn't you want to have all a big business that you're really successful? There's the kind of things like, well, maybe that isn't. Maybe there's some sort of value to this thing that seems like just a dull, boring, ungratifying life that doesn't reward me with these rushes of pleasure all the time, right? Or maybe not even that. Maybe there are these melancholy, difficult feelings that I just want to escape from, and I just want to bypass and get over. But maybe there's something there that, if you have the patience, if you have the sort of like discipline to work with the harder stuff, maybe that opens up something that wasn't there if you're just trying to go for the cheap thrills all the time, right? So I don't know. This is almost an hour, and I've just been kind of. I think there's something about this fast moving Mercury that is like, I'm feeling a little bit maybe there's too much coffee this morning. I feel a bit stimulated, but these are some ideas I have for this transit. Hopefully you like this video. Thanks for watching. See you next time.